Brazil's economy has been recently rocked by scandal after scandal. The Bovespa index had its worst day since 2008 this May, when newly appointed President Michel Temer was named in yet another bribery investigation. Joining me is Huw Jenkins from Latin American investment bank BTG Pactual. Brazil is open for business, but investors are cautious. What should they be keeping their eyes on?
It's been a time of very significant political instability in Brazil, and that's clearly rocked investor confidence. So we've seen the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, and we've seen the allegations brought against President Michel Temer. But I think that the story in Brazil is a story of sort of two halves. One is this political instability, and the other is recovering from a very significant recession, which was really triggered in many ways by the policies of the previous government, which resulted in an inflated public sector, very high level of borrowing, and therefore a very low level of confidence from foreign investors. In a way, there's been a sort of strange Brazilian miracle where we've had Mr. Temer, who was on the same ticket as Dilma Rousseff as the vice president, introduce a 180-degree change in government policy. So we're seeing some very significant legislation, a fiscal responsibility law, a labor law which has significantly improved the ability for flexible labor contracts in Brazil, and generally a move towards creating a much more flexible, modern, open market economy. So I think investors are now generally looking more at the macroeconomic fundamentals and a little bit less at the political instability.
How is that actually coming through in investments and in business growth?
You know, it's interesting. I'd say we certainly haven't yet seen it in business growth. So I think one of the big challenges for this government is, can they actually deliver both economic growth and job growth before the elections in 2018? And that'll be very important, I think, for setting the tone for 2018 and beyond. But if you look at the investment side of the coin, you can see that foreign direct investment has remained very strong in Brazil. So even though they were running a current account deficit over the last 3 years, that's been more than compensated by very high levels of FDI, and we continue to see that in our M&A franchise. And then on the capital market side, after a very quiet period in 14 and 15, from the second half of 2016, we've seen a very significant pickup in equity capital market activity. And that was really as a result of the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the introduction of the new government. So there was generally a scene of significant improvement in the macroeconomic scene. And then secondly, inflation started to tail off, and that of course started to create the conditions for reducing interest rates, which as we know is constructive for equity markets. So then we started to see issuance re-emerge.
Where are we seeing that activity come back?
So we've seen it in real estate, we've seen it in retail, in car rental, in infrastructure, less so in finance, but I would say broadly across the board, there's a hunger for capital in Brazil, where balance sheets have been starved of new capital and new investment. There are now strong investment opportunities and a willingness to come to the markets and issue even on what look like reasonably low prices relative to historical price levels. But the real shift has been the interest by international investors in Brazil. And I think with the recovery of the commodity cycle in the second half of 16, these improvements on the macroeconomic side that I've described, together with generally an improving emerging markets environment from about that time, international investors have started to look at Brazil again. And of course, it's that marginal investor which dictates the price and determines the success of these transactions.
So what should the government be looking at to make sure that this sustained interest from international investors can continue for the next few years?
You know, I think it's going to be a function of continuing to see the political noise decrease. There's a very important event with the election of the next president in the fall of 2018. Continuing to see the macroeconomic numbers play out, and at some point starting to see the conclusion of these corruption investigations. And it feels as though the scope of these investigations are now much better understood, and we're moving towards a resolution. So perhaps people are less anticipatory of significant shocks from these investigations.
Huw, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next video dives deeper into the equity issuances and M&A activity that's come back to Brazil in the last 12 months, so please subscribe or click the thumbnail to watch that. But for all the latest financial news from Latin America, you need to invest some time at worldfinance.com.